The original plan for this was in the very, very first boards that David ever did for the movie. David has this sort of, always has cool title sequences. So one of the first things David said was that he wanted it to be real. He wanted it to feel really, really real. So, which is part of the reason why we ended up with Kevin Mack, because he's a fruitcake about brain science. I mean, he just, for fun, he goes to conferences and talks to neuroscientists, right? So he was kind of a shoo-in. But we needed to storyboard it, and it needed to be basically a ride film. And I've worked on ride films before, and the biggest problem is that they're one cut. So in a number of conversations with David, it became clear that what we needed is to do our own ride film map. So we hired this woman, Catherine Jones, who's a medical illustrator, has a lot of experience in like interactive and other kinds of computer stuff. But primarily one of the big things that sort of sold David on her is that she worked on the Visible Human project, where they sliced up people and then they show you what it looks like to go in as out of someone. And she had some neuroscience background as well. She's one of the few people I know who likes to watch surgeries. She'll say, well, what are you doing this weekend? Well, there's this great surgery up at Wisconsin. I'm going up there to watch this guy go in his brain and take this tumor out. And it's like, sure. Anyway, so she got in there, sat down with David. They talked about what it ought to look like. David came up with the idea that it should look like a night dive. There should be sort of a source of light coming from us, and then there's sort of some kind of ambient light, but not very much. And it would be really dark. He was really happy to find out that the brain had no color to it, basically, internally. So it could be really monochromatic. She did some research. She talked to him about it and ultimately picked a spot in the brain where we should start, which is sort of where a fearful thought in the amygdala would probably begin, and then mapped out, of course, how we'd get from there out to his forehead. And ultimately, she produced this book that had all the different rooms. In ride film terms, we had all the rooms worked out. And most of the doors, how do you get around this corner so you can dump the room that you just came from and get onto the one that you're in, and all those sorts of things. So we had all that when Kevin Mack finally got started. I know that once he realized he was going to be awarded it, he also did a lot of work on his own, on shaders and stuff, which was kind of like off the books and getting ready. But in the long run, they had to turn out this massive amount of film in no time at all. So it was kind of interesting. And unfortunately, of course, you've got these big bright titles over the top that kind of hide a lot of the work, who were done by Scott Makla. He came on, designed the font. He was Mr. Font. He believed in fonts, and he worked up something for Fight Club. And then shortly after that, actually, he died one morning. It was like, we got this like rumor coming from White and Kennedy or something. He was just like really quick. Young man, boom, overnight. But David originally wanted the titles to only be on legibly for about 8 frames, and then have this sort of after image, like a retinal purple thing going down for maybe another 2 or 3 seconds, so that you could read them sort of as an after image over the top of the thing. But you had to be like on the edge of your seat to catch anybody's title. But there were like lots of legal problems with that, so ultimately it didn't happen. Up with, and it kind of gave the editor something to sort of look at in the early stages of the cut. So we put together this funny kind of ad, and it sounds really simple, but it turned out to be quite a logistical nightmare on one level or another, because as simple as an idea as it is, we didn't really map it out so that it could be pixelated and shot in camera, which would have taken days. We tried to take a couch out of the room. Its radiosity affects everything around it. It's a big deal in CG these days talking about radiosity, but if you put a couch in a room that's green next to a white carpet, the carpet's not white, it's green because it's reflecting the light of the couch. And so you have to decide which carpet are you using in the shot. Obviously, once the cutting mats to carefully massage how the floor changed, and that got.
And action. Got it. Print that one. Very nice. Got it. On that first step, it's slowing you up a little going a step forward to the back door of the room. Where does it lead? To your cave. Now step forward into your cave. That's right. You're going deeper into your cave. And you're going to find your power animal. And cut with that.
The penguin was number 2 of all the shots we awarded because we knew we needed really good character animators. And basically, outside of Disney, there's Blue Sky. I'd never worked with them before, and they have this incredible renderer that makes their stuff look really photoreal on top of being good character animators. So it was a pretty easy fit. But it was funny because we started out with David saying, okay, this has to be totally photoreal, has to do this, that, the other thing. We surveyed it. The penguin really walked on the ground. They built the penguin just like a real penguin inside, and they got the little pin feathers working. Everything was beautiful, and it matched penguin footage we gave them. So this was like this king penguin, and he walked a certain way and did all this stuff. And once it finally got to that stage and we started showing it to David, David started saying, well, that's great, but, you should look at that sequence of Mary Poppins. And all of a sudden it was like off to La La Land. So it looks like the most incredible animatronic you've ever seen. No one will ever believe it's real, but on some level you believe it's there, but you don't believe it's a real penguin. So anyway, one thing about the ice cave is they didn't really know how big the penguin would be. So by the time you put Edward and the penguin together, you realize that he was like way up at the top of the frame with no headroom, and the penguin was walking on the frame line at the bottom. So they basically, Blue Sky just cut it and like raised the floor in there, so it sort of cuts him off at the shins instead of at the ankle. I remember they sent us the schedule and showed how they could be done like right after we finished production. It was like, no, sorry. No, this is going to be like a year of post almost, so you have to wait a bit. But they did all sorts of cool little things, but it's basically 2 little penguin shots and lots of adding breath. At the time they were a sister company to VIFX, they had all this breath left over from Titanic. So they recycled Leo DiCaprio's breath to come out of Ed's mouth. And there you go. Photogrammetry. That technique kind of gets you into all the different, if you will, Jack's POV shots. The condo stuff, the flying around inside the bomb, the out the window and down into the street through the van. All that stuff is all done the same way. The craziest one was flying down the side of the building where we went into this derelict building right next, on Figueroa. And we had to go to all the different floors and hang his camera out there. And he hadn't really realized that we were going to do this. And Michael was really being careful about how he got his camera on the end of the boom. And I just sort of like strapped it on and started doing it. So because I was the one person he couldn't sort of slow down. And I would just like poke it out there because we only had like 2 hours inside this building before they kicked us out. The cool thing about that technique, of course, is that you do get those images. You get all those cool things you can get out of a still camera that you can't get out of a motion picture camera. And then you get all the flexibility of CG, where you can leap out a building and pop through the street and, do all these cool things. The technique that Boof used is a little bit of a variation on the basic theme of image-based modeling and rendering. The first part of which is known as photogrammetry in map making, so it tends to pop up as photogrammetry. What Boof has come up with is how to get photoreal without having to come up with the world's most perfect shaders. They take these texture maps from an image, so it's an image-based modeling. From image-based modeling, they then do image-based rendering, which is taking the image and saying, this pixel seen from all these different pictures is this color. So we use that all over the place for things that were like not necessarily good ideas to do in CG most of the time. Like the whole sequence flying through the Jack's condo is entirely CG from ground up. But we spent 4 days in Jack's condo with a still photographer and a Nikon getting very close to everything we'd fly by and taking still images of it so that we could very carefully map all that back on. And then, of course, when they finally built it all, Boof had to then ray trace reflections for all the shiny things, because part of the reason we did it this way is David wanted to have this big shiny tea kettle that we could fly right up to and not see a camera reflection in it. I want to just be pushing in on it. I want to pull out of it. So Chicho and Christoph from Boof, they did a previs. They showed it to David like on a Sunday before the shoot, and he said, "Sure, let's do it." So art department went out and built a trash can where all the trash could be taken apart, so we could photograph it from all the angles inside, even though we could never get a camera inside. And then when they finally got it back to booth, and they've modeled it all, and they're doing the usual image-based rendering technique to it. It was just everything in there was shiny. Everything needed to be ray traced reflections. And so they decided to do something really rash, and they decided to make it a full radiosity rendering. An average frame on that took like a day to render almost. I think it took like an 8-hour day to render.
Kevin Haug.
The buildings was the most classic example of total collaborative effort. So we ran around first to find all those buildings. Then we pre-visited extensively until David liked exactly the timings that he saw and where the pyro would go off and how all that happened. And then we took those particular angles and we went back out with Richard Lund and his 8x10 camera and shot 45-minute exposures through tinted glass. You know, every one of these buildings in all of its living color, and that is what made up the Translight.
Doc Bailey.
I'd never built anything for a Translight. I barely even knew what one was. It was frame one of the animation sequence. Basically, it meant that the whole scene had to be designed first in order for me to just produce this one pair of pictures for the Translight. And so I had to work backwards in a way. I had to make sure that all of the decisions that I was making and that David was making in the design of the Translight would satisfy the requirements for the animation and vice versa.
All of that had to happen before we got the models even to where Doc started disassembling them. He ultimately decided on the most tedious way of doing it. I mean, he'll describe it better than I can, but ultimately it's take a building, take it entirely apart, then take the parts of the building and break them even into smaller parts, and then put it all back together again and animate all those pieces. It looks really good and chaotic and it looks very real, but it's a massive undertaking to do. It's really slow.
Well, it's kind of an odd situation to find yourself in, this simulating a demolition that can be done using other techniques. I mean, the standard technique for this is for a bunch of boys to get together and build these models and take them out into the desert and make a big mess, you know. We did a little bit of that in order to get the fire, to get the pyro bursts, and John Sturber did really a wonderful job, and that was a real good move because it lent a level of realism to the shot. The rest of it was all synthetic wireframes that had been just blown to pieces with these really exquisite wallpaper textures of each building on top of them. And so I had these big-ass 6K by 8K files for each one of the buildings. It became really the blueprint for how the buildings were assembled and disassembled. I knew that if I made the wireframe directly from the photographs, that the underlying structure for each one of the photographs would precisely align itself with each of the elements. And when all of that was built, then I went about the business of shattering all of those. And in order to shatter all that stuff, I had to write with my assistant 2 new animation systems. And I arrived at the concept by working on the game with David a couple of years before, where I had a similar assignment, which was to crash a ceiling as the actor's falling through it. And that was a paltry 5,000 chunks of glass and some dust in that. What we were talking about on Fight Club was potentially 3 or 4 million pieces, so that was quite a leap.
The original idea was that the way we were going to make sure that all those CG buildings looked good was that we were going to have grain from the foreground to put onto it, which meant that the reflections in the windows and everything had to be the real reflections from the room. And we were going to have real flash bulbs going off exactly timed perfectly to fit all of the flashes outside that needed to do lens flares. So all that was worked out. And we end up with one stumbling block. Both Ed and Helen are wearing black garments, and it needs to be against a black background. The theory was, okay, fine, we'll put a bright backlight on her. We'll get a little bit of an edge, and they can roto it. Unfortunately, what happened is that instead of standing right up against the glass where we could do this, they stood way back from the glass. Only her hair is lit. So in the long run, Gray had to hire a guy to cut her up in little pieces and sort of track them around. It was a horrible job. But in the long run, the reflections are real. The grain from the foreground is put back over the background, and it sort of kisses the whole thing together.
Trust me. Everything's gonna be fine.
Yeah, if we would just get rid of the fucking people. The fucking actors. I almost think it starts to make its roll too soon. It should start its roll like right there. So it's like, I would say there's kind of two things going on. There's the back panel, which is very chaotic. That is the skin on the outside of the plane. There's whatever's on the middle of the insulation, and then there's the pieces of the, it's literally like a house of cards just kind of flying away. So I think if you start with just the pieces that you have flying off and getting going in an interesting way, then you can go in afterwards, kind of break it and say, well, this corner, this one's going to stay. I mean, I think this is basically it. This is basically what we want to do. I'd like to see the wing out there and get an idea, and I know that that's completely phony baloney.
The airplane was one of those things that it was a really intense collaborative effort. We had to collaborate with previs, special effects, art department. There was a whole issue with casting at one point because we wanted the guy, Kevin Mack, who was going to be dealing with the CG part of the film, to be in it. So we had to put him in the chair. He's the guy in the chair who gets bounced up and down. And then there was this whole issue of what's the plane going to look like. At one point, we were going to actually previs an actual simulation of what would happen if we really did this with an airplane. So it was all sorts of different kinds of fitting and piecing together, which all went really, really smoothly on the airplane. We had a chance to previs way in advance. We knew exactly what David wanted to look like. We had a chance to take that, port it over to motion control, test out the shot on the motion control rig with Cliff's rig there with all the seats in there. David could, as he did, hate it the first time he saw it all come together, so we could tweak it, fix it, and got it all looking pretty tight before it ever got to stage. We even knew exactly how many panels of Mylar we had to lay on the floor, because by the time we were done prevising it, it was like, well, you need 8 pieces here and 6 pieces there, and that's all you need. And the grips, of course, bought 15 or 20 extra pieces. And it was like, no, you'll never need to take them out of the bag. So we set that all up, did multiple passes on motion control, which was a little tricky because motion control doesn't actually go as fast as that rig needed to go. So we had to do speed aperture control, where we had to undercrank so the camera could leap 2 feet in 2 frames and then bounce back again like another foot. And this was all supposed to happen with live action actors there. But in the end, it actually worked out pretty well. I mean, the speed aperture control and motion control is flawless. So there wasn't an exposure problem. It was just a matter of would things look undercranked when you're looking at it in this film. So that all happened, and we got the green screen passes and all the extra goodies, and we put Mr. Mack in there, and we pounded him up and down. Actually, he got hit in the face with a pillow at one point that actually broke his glasses. And we shot some extra elements for magazines flying and things that you wouldn't want to throw at Kevin Mack, basically. Some oxygen masks that got comped into the top. And then they did all the really nasty stuff like bottles of Jack Daniels and all that sort of stuff, which is sad, actually, because David decided to overcrank the shot at sort of 60 frames a second, but if he'd overcranked it at 360, you'd see all the stuff. But even as it is, it doesn't feel that violent. At 60, it's a little bit balletic, and we never really could see all the goodies that are in the air. They're all basically motion blurs. There's these perfect little bottles of Jack Daniels that go flying by, and all you see is like one frame, a streak. And he said, see, that's the label, and that's the cap. Oh, okay, I guess, yeah, sure. It's easy to make something look good. To match exactly to the reel that's in the foreground is actually way more. So I think they had to write stuff just to be able to kind of see the other guys in the background. The most outstanding thing about the sex sequence was the fact that it was a total R&D effort from beginning to end. We had no real clear clue what it was going to look like until fairly close to the end. I think David said it was as though one of the statues from Mount Rushmore was fucking the Statue of Liberty. It was supposed to be this sort of giant thing, and we were going to be this little gnat flying around them. So we tried a couple of different sort of CG things because it was kind of clear this was not going to happen any other way than CG. But close-up people with lots of skin and hair is like the hardest thing to do, and it was sort of bleeding edge, and nobody really knew if they could do it or not. And of course, we didn't really have the money to do it since it had never been budgeted originally. So we brought in a bunch of different people. The people who had the coolest looking test was Booth. And David kind of dug the way they wanted to do it, which was all these still cameras. Then on the 2 days that we had to shoot Brad and Helena and the 2 body doubles, I remember Brad coming in at one point and saying he wanted to see a pile of pornography so he could pick positions out of that. But basically, pornography was boring in terms of like different positions. They're all the same positions. We actually pulled out positions like out of the Kama Sutra. Literally, like they were all named after Richard Burton's names for different poses in the Kama Sutra. David picked like 6, and I think he added 4 more on the day. And we had our 15 cameras set up and our little computer controlled, perfection, all the shutters open and closed at the same time. And we got a lot of good information, but we still really didn't know what the fuck it was going to look like. We kind of had an idea. David had sort of set up every single still picture himself. We thought we had this rig that was great, and we just set it there and focus it and it'd be ready. And then David went around and looked through every single camera and refocused it and reset it up. But even so, it looked like we needed to be even closer than that if we wanted to do the giant statue thing. So it ended up becoming about motion blur. And motion blur is like something that's doable in CG, but it's also kind of bleeding edge. So we ended up with bleeding edge motion blur, bleeding edge skin, bleeding edge hair, moving CG people, the whole thing. So it was just really hard to get it from A to B. But in the end, it's such a cool technique because it's probably, ultimately the decision was that Helena had to look pretty. We have one that's really grotesque and sort of Francis Bacon looking. I'm still looking for the right movie for that.
All right, stand by. We're going to do a dry rehearsal at speed for Mike Runyon. Is that it?
Are we going to go on the next take, David?
Yeah.
We need to see that one rain tower on for a minute to check our topper on the back.
Okay.
I think
Good on an inch if you can. You did? All right, is it locked? Back to 1.
now.
Okay, that's all right. We're at the end of the shop. We don't need it.
Thought I'd like to mention that.
Not a problem. This is starting. We're in the back, like half of the frame.
Yeah, I hear you.
The bumper of the first car, so we just get.
Okay, Michael, stop it right there. Stop it right there.
The post is not going to
No.
just some things. Okay.
Yeah.
Michael Heron.
Okay, we need to swing that condor so that we get more rain in our foreground over here, so we got to swing it back. Out, camera right.
Roll cameras, please. Action, 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 action.
The back of the car is right where the thing was letting it go. I want to move this car back so that the thing is like right over the back window, so that it comes in and hits the back corner panel.
That's what
Boom.
it's going to do is turn this one more this way so it hits it more here rather than here. And we're going to flatten the tires on the right side so it hopefully turns over.
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, but here's what I'm saying.
Right.
You're doing this like, you're saying turn this. I'm saying leave this out like this and hit it
Right.
more like that, so
Yes.
that it goes over that way. Okay, here we go. Go ahead and bring up the rain. John, that's fine. Clear, roll cameras. Get speed. Ready, and action. you got to be down a little bit. You don't want to show it.
The gunshot's sort of a long, sad story of a makeup effect that wasn't meant to happen, despite heroic efforts on the part of Rob Bottin and his guys. Basically abandoned our original idea of trying to synchronize photosonics cameras because they're just too... There's too many flaky parts to that chain, and in the long run we had to give it up. But while we were giving that up, Rob was giving the college try to the head. Basic idea was there from the beginning, and it was always to point synchronized high-speed cameras at a dummy and blow it up, and then synchronized high-speed cameras at Ed and not blow him up. In the end, we kind of blew him up, and we didn't. I mean, we got some interesting and often funny results, but we never really got